Tonight is going to be a very interesting session. We have here already Dr. Andrew Nevin, and I'll just quickly introduce him. By the way, my name is Abraham. I'm sure Yinka will join in later. But before I introduce Dr. Nevin, please, I'd like to appeal to you. Kindly keep your microphones muted, and if possible, turn off your videos, because you understand that most people are joining from their houses and we're seeing some people that are not well dressed and all of that. So we would like to keep that distraction away. So please turn off your videos, or turn off your microphones. Now, if you have any questions, kindly drop them on the chat. So if you click on your screen, you see at the bottom of your screen, you see participants. If you click that, you will see where you can chat to your left. So you could just click chat and drop your comments. So if you have any question, kindly do that. While Doctor is speaking, please drop your questions. We'll put them together and see how much you can take at the end of this presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Andrew Nevin. He is the advisory partner and chief economist of PwC Nigeria. He has over 32 years of experience. He's had his career at McKinsey, worked in Toronto and Paris, in Africa for a very long time. He holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University, has an MA in philosophy and politics from Balliol College, Oxford University, and he has a BSc in computer science and mathematics from the University of Western Ontario, Canada. So he will be sharing with us tonight. I want you to listen attentively, get your pens and papers. At the end of this session tonight, I believe you all registered. We'll send you the links to the recording. I would like to welcome Dr. Andrew, and we can now start this session. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello, can people hear me? Hello? Okay, so let me start again, please, and send a message if there's any other technical problem. I apologize. I should always use the phone. The computer is a little bit uncertain. So, but let me quickly go again, and I really apologize for the technical problems. But if we go back historically to the time I've been in Nigeria, we had a financial crisis in 2009. Of course, the governor of the central bank was Governor Sanusi, who later became the mayor of Kano, and then was, well, we all know what happened there. And at the time, the world had a deep, sharp recession as a result of the financial crisis. There were, many of you are, I'm sure, too young to remember, but where there were bailouts of banks around the world, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom. Royal Bank of Scotland was taken over by the government, as was Lloyd's. We had the disappearance of a number of major financial institutions, the most famous of which was Lehman Brothers in September of 2008. But other groups like Bear Stearns also disappeared. And there was the destruction of, a little bit like today, millions and millions of jobs around the world on that. And this bubble, or this crisis, was caused largely by a massive bubble in US residential real estate. But as we came out of the crisis, what happened was that there was a sharp rebound, and in Nigeria, oil prices rose very quickly back up to over $100 in a matter of about 6 months. And so with $100 oil in the years 2010, 2011, 2012, and even a bit of 2013, there was a lot of money in the Nigerian system. There was rapid, at least in GDP terms, GDP growth. But unfortunately, in those years, there was not much savings or useful productivity from that oil windfall. So what happened was that money was brought to the country and then essentially spent or squandered, or if we're honest, in many cases was diverted, in fact. And we ended up in a situation when the Buhari regime, when President Buhari was elected in 2015, was facing very difficult economic situation. Oil price had dropped significantly. There was not any real reserves or savings from the time when sorry, I'm just going to turn off my video. There was not really any savings from all of the boom years, and he inherited a very difficult economic situation. There was a new plan put together, the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, which focused on diversification and investment around the country, particularly in infrastructure. Unfortunately, in the last 3 or 4 years, there hasn't been, again, a huge amount of progress on these issues. And we've had very kind of anemic growth, as you're aware, and high unemployment. So growth has been about 2%. I don't really like GDP growth as a measure, but it's the one that we have. But the population is growing almost 3%. So if we have 1 or 2% GDP growth, effectively per capita, at least on that measure, we're getting poorer and poorer. And that was a term that PwC really coined, and I started using in 2017. And I think now people all understand that. So that's the background of Nigeria's economic situation coming into this crisis. So just hold some of those thoughts. And let me now go and talk about the economic impact at a global level. And let me start by saying that I think most people around the world have been very slow to pick up on the level of economic devastation that would come from this health crisis. I've been following it very closely since the beginning of January. But even in February, I think commentators didn't really understand what would happen when you had a lockdown. I mean, the ones who are in the West were a long way away from Wuhan or China, where the first lockdowns appeared. But if you think about it for a minute, you realize that in a lockdown, economic activity comes largely to a halt, right? I mean, there's no, people are not spending because they're not doing the activities. Restaurants are closed, travel is closed, hotels are closed, group gatherings are closed, there's no weddings, there's no nightclubs, people are not driving around. And I think that effect really was not well understood. But what we've learned now is that one person's spending is another person's income. So when everyone stops their activity, the level of economic activity overall falls off a cliff. And it was happening in Wuhan, but because it was not happening in the West, I don't think we were observing it very much. When it moved to Italy, I think people started to realize what would happen, because you had at first northern Italy, but eventually all of Italy locked down, which essentially meant that there were no tourists. Every hotel was going to go insolvent. Obviously, the Italian airline is insolvent. Restaurants are all going to go bankrupt because they have no customers. And it dawned on people that we were headed not just for a health crisis, but to an economic crisis. But even saying that, in mid-February or even late February, there was still a huge underestimation of the economic impact of the economic side of this pandemic, because you had people like World Bank, I can't remember if it was them or IMF, but you had people saying, look, growth was supposed to be 4% globally in GDP terms, and it was now going to move to something like 2%. So significant, but not catastrophic. And it was only as we got into March that people realized we were not headed to a slowdown in growth. We were headed to a global recession and even a global depression. And just to put some of the numbers around the globe on the level of economic devastation. So in 5 weeks, the United States has lost, I believe, 26 million jobs. To put that in perspective, the total workforce in the United States is about 160 million people, if I remember right. So you're talking about more then about a fifth of the people in the space of 5 weeks losing their job. In the UK, they're talking, if the lockdown continues to the end of the second quarter, they're talking about a GDP decrease of 35%, if I read the numbers right. The government is. So you think about that for a minute. I mean, we had a recession which was very painful at 1.6% decrease in GDP. 35% in one quarter is extraordinary. In Europe, the IMF, or the European Central Bank, are talking about a decrease in GDP for the whole year right now of about 8%, but it could go worse than that. In Australia, they're talking about a decrease of GDP in the first half of the year of about 10%. And this is a country that hasn't had a recession in 40 years or something. So these are all extraordinary numbers and show you the slowdown in economic activity as people can't interact. And of course, Africa is not immune to it. So the numbers, the official numbers from the World Bank, for example, have Africa's economy decreasing in 2020 by, at the moment, 2 to 5%. And of course, we have a high growth rate of population in Africa of approximately 2.5 to 3%, which means income per capita under these numbers falling 5 to 7%. So an order of magnitude worse than 2016 for us. But for Nigeria, and I'm sorry to give so much bad news about this, but the situation is particularly bleak because we're also, in addition to the general reduction in economic activity, we're also an oil dependent state, particularly the government, not so much the people because they don't see much of the oil revenue. But the government's primary revenue source continues to be oil. 60% of the tax receipts. So this goes back to what I was saying a bit earlier, that the attempt by the Buhari administration to rotate out of oil, which they knew was required, is not being successful. And now we're starting to pay the price. So you have this oil price collapse. And I think if those of you who've been reading the headlines saw some incredible things happen. So the oil price in the United States went negative. Why is it going negative? Well, of course, with this economic destruction and the reduction in activity, we're not using as much oil. So in a typical day around the world, we use about 100 million barrels of oil. Nigeria produces 2% of that, a little over, on a good day, or a little over 2 million barrels. And at the end of 2019, the oil market was roughly in balance. There was 100 million barrels being used, and there was 100 million barrels being produced. And you may recall in January, the price actually went up over $70. And this seems like a very long time ago. The Nigerian stock market was the best performing stock market in the world for the first month of the year. But now, because of this, so now we've taken out 25 to 35 million barrels of demand. We are still producing 100 million barrels. OPEC has announced a reduction in 10 million barrels a day. So now we have 90 million barrels being, even if that occurs, which is starting on May 1st, you have 90 million barrels produced. You have demand down at 65 to 75 million barrels. You still are storing an enormous amount of oil. And the reason the oil price turned negative in the United States for West Texas Intermediate is that there's nowhere to store it. People are producing oil with nowhere to store. And literally this week, you're going to see people producing less oil, not because OPEC says anything, but just because if you're getting less than zero for your product, you're going to stop producing it. Now, the impact on Nigeria, so I was asked to speak about fiscal and monetary impact. So before I turn to that subject, let me just say a few words around what other countries have done. Because again, I think now that it's recognized that this is the gravest economic crisis ever, really worse than several centuries. I've seen one analyst put it, certainly worse than the Great Depression we're on track for. But unlike the Great Depression, the fiscal and monetary authorities have recognized there's a need to act. You can't have a 35% reduction in GDP. You can't have a 10% reduction without some reaction from the authorities. And the reactions have been extraordinary. So in the United States, in just a matter of 4 weeks, we're effectively up to the fourth stimulus program. The total amount of the stimulus, well, it's hard to keep track of, but of the fiscal stimulus, as far as I can see, the numbers would be about $4 trillion US dollars. The economy in the United States is $20 trillion. So that's a 20% of GDP is already committed to stimulus. A lot of it's been spent, and a lot of people are saying it won't be sufficient. In Germany, they have a loan program, very soft, sort of forgivable loans, 25% of GDP. In the United Kingdom, they have a fiscal stimulus of 300 billion pounds, UK pounds, and that's about 20% of their economy. So people around the world have recognized that. And similarly, on the monetary side, you've had more drops in interest rates. They were essentially close to zero. They've gone down a little bit further they can. But in addition, you've also had the Fed, in particular, the Federal Reserve of the United States, taking extraordinary steps to buy assets. So you might have seen there's just been such turmoil in the stock market the last, I would say, 5-6 weeks, maybe 6-7 weeks now. But in addition to that, what's not watched as much publicly is tremendous pressure in the fixed income market. So the bond market is actually much bigger than the stock market, in some ways quite a bit more important. And what's happened, of course, is if a corporate entity has a bond and their revenue goes to zero, that bond is likely to default. So if you're a hotel, an airline, cruise ship owner, an oil producer, and you've got debt, that debt can no longer be serviced. So the debt, what's happening, of course, is the price of the debt falls because there's a higher risk of default. And the Fed has stepped up with so this is separate than the fiscal stimulus. This is the monetary stimulus. Has stepped up with a program that's another $4 trillion, essentially to buy assets, including what was previously unthinkable, buying junk bonds. So on a global scale, you're seeing all these fiscal and monetary responses. Now, in Africa, we're not immune from this. The World Bank has kind of put out a number that they expect the reduction in GDP in sub-Saharan Africa to be about 2 to 5% this year in 2020. Of course, Africa's population is growing, so per capita, this would mean a reduction per capita, if these numbers were accurate, of about 5 to 7%, which is a huge burden on that. And again, I think these numbers are going to be worse because every day the news gets worse. Now, South Africa is talking about a reduction in GDP of 6%. But there's been, again, fiscal actions. South Africa, for example, has a program. Kenya has a program including cutting the salaries of ministers, but also some fiscal stimulus. We'll come a little bit to what Nigeria's announced in a minute, but the thing is, what I talked about in some other countries where they had a program of 20 to 25% of GDP, the programs in Africa, because there's so many fewer resources, have been much smaller. So about 1 to 1.5% from the governments. Though we have had some support from the multilateral organizations, so the IMF and the World Bank. For example, the IMF has already announced a $50 billion kind of emergency program, which doesn't come with the usual stringent conditions. The only problem is 80 countries have already applied for it, and if you divide $50 billion by 80 countries, per country, it's not a lot. So if we look at the Nigerian situation, if Africa as a whole is going to decline in GDP by 2 or 3 to 5%, and maybe worse, what's going to happen here? Well, we're an oil economy. The federal government's oil revenue in a space of 1 month is effectively gone to zero. I mean, not only do we not get, so we don't even get the Brent price, which has dropped as low as $20 and maybe lower today. We get a discount to the Brent price, but not only that, I don't believe Nigerian crude is actually being sold right now. What I believe has happened is it's in tankers that are doing figure eights in various parts of the ocean around the world. So essentially the oil revenue that's going to flow to the Nigerian government, has dropped to zero. So what's that going to mean in a fiscal space? Well, before all of this happened, the government was projecting a deficit spending of about 10 trillion naira and raising about 8 trillion naira in revenue, a little bit less. So at least a 2 trillion naira deficit, which is not huge by global standards. But now with the oil, even at the benchmark $30 oil, which we're well below, and some cuts in spending, the latest number that was coming out was a deficit of about 5 trillion. But that is not attainable right now. As I said, oil is not gone. Essentially, there's no revenue from oil anymore. So if the government continued spending what it was spending before, or the limited cuts that they had suggested, we'd still be facing a deficit of 6 or 7 trillion naira this year. And of course, the government shouldn't be cutting at this point in time. If we look at other countries, what's happened is they've had fiscal stimulus because they need to stimulate the economy into that. On the monetary policy side, I think it's fair to say the CBN is trying, but the mechanisms they've had, a little bit of reduction in some of the loan rates to these intervention programs, some forbearance for people who have mortgages, don't really touch very many Nigerians, because very few Nigerians are really borrowers or have a mortgage. I had a mortgage, for example, but very few people do. So the result of the monetary intervention is likely to be not very small. The other challenge we face is that, of course, the federal government really has the ability to issue naira, or the central banks to some extent they control the money supply, but the states don't control the money supply, and their federal allocation, I think the April allocation is reasonable because it's it was an oil that was sold back in January, effectively by the time it works through. But the federal allocation to the states is very, very quickly going to go to zero. And if it goes to zero, most of the states, some of the states still, as I'm sure people in this call are aware, get 90% of their revenue from the federal allocation. If that allocation goes close to zero, because obviously oil part drops away, corporate income tax drops away because corporations are making losses, the states are effectively going to be, many states are effectively going to be insolvent in a matter of months. So I say all this because it's just a grave economic crisis for us, and yet it's difficult to see how to move forward. And what we've said, not publicly, but what we've advised the government to the extent that we do, we said actually, we are in an economic emergency. And actually, South Africa used that term. But the number one thing we need to focus on in the short term is actually to make sure that people have food. Because if you think about the structure of the economy, we have a situation where something like 70 to 80% of employment is in the informal sector. Most of these people in the informal sector are essentially earning a daily wage. So for them to eat that day or that week, they need to earn money that week. When we have a lockdown, as I said a little earlier, what happens is economic activity collapses. So we all now understand that someone's spending is someone else's income. So that spending goes away. The person earning the income no longer gets it, and people are not eating. So we've said we understand the longer term economic issues, and there's lots of things that need to be done. But the number one priority for the government right now is to actually focus on, one, getting money into the hands of the bottom of the pyramid. And there have been a number of things the government is going on in terms of palliatives. You might have seen the controversy around giving people money in their bank account, but then they had to have less than 5,000 naira in it, and the complexities around that. But however it's done, getting money into the hands of the bottom of the pyramid is the most critical thing. But along with keeping the food supply chain working, right? So you can imagine, for food, both of it, whether it's produced domestically or parts of it are imported, some of the ingredients, it's complicated and it moves across state boundaries. The production facilities are in different places. Where it's grown is not where it's ultimately consumed. So those complexities mean that it takes some work to keep the food supply chain working. But those two things, getting money into the bottom of the pyramid's hands and keeping the food supply chain working, for us, are the most urgent tasks of the federal government right now. The last thing I'll just say before stopping, as I said, I really apologize for having very little good news, but we're having this session so people can reflect on serious issues. The last thing I'll say is that that the health affects itself. I'm not an epidemiologist, though I did run a hospital through the SARS clinic, so we were very concerned about these issues. But from an epidemiological viewpoint, I think that what we've learned from around the world is that what that this disease, this transmission mechanism is obviously slowed down by the social distancing, by the lockdowns. So if you go to take the case of Italy or the case of the UK, things were spinning rapidly out of control. The health system was going to be overwhelmed, not enough protective gear, not enough staff for the number of people that were ill. So then you do the lockdown, and what you get is slower growth in the number of people that contract COVID-19. So you get less people per day that are coming to the emergency room, putting pressure on them. So that's a positive thing, and ultimately we hope less people that are dying every day. The problem, of course, is when you're locked down, you have this economic problem. So we have a very difficult trade-off between the economic issues and the health issue. And of course, at some point, the people themselves also decide if there's a health risk on that. So it's very intractable issue. And I think we're entering the stage in Nigeria where people are realizing we had so few cases. If we go back 4 weeks ago, essentially, and I'm a friend and a big fan of the Commissioner for Health for Lagos, who's absolutely brilliant in doing the best we can, but we all understand the reality on the ground in Nigeria. Not a robust public health system, not a lot of facilities testing either materials or capability to do the testing. So when we're repeating to ourselves that there's only this many cases, I think we need to ask whether or not that's actually accurate, what's actually going on. And if you now look at the last week or so in Africa, but also in Nigeria, you start to see the number of cases starting to be more and more. So very concerning as we enter May on that. So let me stop there. As I said, I wish I had better news for this group, but you're all young leaders. You all have a role to play in getting the country and the continent through this crisis, keeping people safe around you to the extent that you can, and playing a positive role. So let me stop there. I'm happy to take any questions or any comments from the group.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Nevin, for the short presentation you made. I'll quickly go to the questions. The first question comes from Nevin. He's asking about the Nigerian Stock Exchange. That for the rest of the year, what are your thoughts as regards to the performance of the companies listed on the exchange? We're beginning to see the performance of the banks, particularly they've not been very good. But overall, what are your thoughts around what to expect as regards the performance of the stock market? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think that the stock exchange is, of course, in Nigeria is largely made up of the banks, are the biggest preponderance of it, and then to some extent, fast-moving consumer good companies as well. A lot of people like Unilever. So the banks, I mean, at one level, I think that the banks what we've already seen, are able to operate in this environment well. They're adjusting well. They have more technicalities. It's less of a physical product. So I think they're, from an operational viewpoint, a lot of them, and they adjust very fast. So they may, but on the other hand, I don't want to say they're going to do well, because the truth is, at the end of the day, a bank can only do as well as its clients, right? And to the extent banks have exposure to oil and gas, we're going to see, and some of them, of course, to discos, which are going to continue to have problems in this. So I think that as an investor, I think you have an almost impossible choice at this point in time, and the market's being crushed. is there any point in selling now in case it comes back? So, as I said, I'm not going to make any prediction about the stock market. What I can say, though, however, is that the companies themselves are adapting very, very quickly to it. And I think for the fast-moving consumer good companies, they're always going to have a demand for it. But the banks, I think, have operationally done a good job, but they may be hit by further bad loans, particularly from the oil and gas industry. But no predictions on the direction of the stock market.
Okay, thank you. The next question here, Jimmy is asking, what's your view with regard to the trajectory of potential recovery in the economy? Most of the predictions that we are seeing in recent times, they're all pointing towards an extended period of recession. So, if that is going to happen, from your own perspective, when is it likely that Nigeria will recover? Of course, we have to put in perspective that the COVID-19 has a lot to play for things to get back to normal. Yes, so what are your thoughts, Dr. Nevin?
Well, I don't think the world is going to be back to normal till either 60 to 70% of the world has been exposed to COVID-19 or we have an effective vaccine. And the latter one, I'm not a scientist, but everyone says, who is a scientist, says the latter is at least a year away. The former, there's a lot of work now in developed nations to measure how many people have actually had it and don't know they had it, because obviously we know there are people that have had, many people have had COVID-19 who are asymptomatic, don't necessarily know they had it. And that is a critical number because it tells you how is the theory of epidemiology, how is the immunity building up, right? But a lot of the discussion, I can tell you, in the Western press right now, as they are contemplating, so you might have seen news around relaxation of the lockdown in certain U.S. states. In Denmark, children are starting to go back to school. In Spain, it's being debated. In Italy, there's been a very minimal relaxation of the lockdown rules. So people are debating, if they relax the lockdown, are we going to head to essentially a double event where COVID-19 comes back again, so that the lockdown was effective in preventing the spread, but because it hasn't got to 60 or 70% of the population, there's not really herd immunity. So any relaxation of the lockdown is going to lead to a resurgence, which is going to then have its impact on economic affairs. So I think, what do they say? You want to hope for the best, but plan for the worst. I think that companies and individuals should plan for this from an economic impact. Well, the acute economic impact, 6 to 12 months, and then we're going to have the longer term impact as we try to recover. Because of course, what happens in something like this is, if you have destruction of you lose your job, destruction of personal wealth, people. There have been predictions of large number of people in Africa falling into poverty, several hundred million more people. To recover from that will then take several years. And in the context of Nigeria, the only recovery is going to come from private sector investment. So people are going to have to, because the government isn't going to have the resources or not necessarily be able to invest them in the right way. So if we are going to have an economic recovery and finally achieve the diversification that the Buhari regime has always wanted to do since 2015, they're going to have to make the right policy choices coming out of this. As I said, the earliest I can see coming out in any meaningful sense from an economic viewpoint is 6 months. So that's kind of the fall. The 6 month view, as I keep stressing, is to make sure that everyone in the country can get food. The food supply keeps changing. We don't have social unrest.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I'm going to join like 3 questions together. It's targeted to the federal government. From your presentation earlier, you had mentioned that, and we've been following the news, the federal government is finding it difficult to sell their oil. And the revenue from the oil is what is shared at the FAC. Most states are going to grow broke in the next few weeks, for the states that do not have very strong internal generated revenue. So what are the options that are open to the federal government to be able to weather this period? We can see from all statistics that the capacity of the federal government is constrained right now, especially the major source of revenue is not generating in the last few weeks, and looking forward because of the global glut in oil supply and the falling oil price. So what are the options open to the federal government, and how are they going to create a miracle to be able to perform to fund the state?
Well, I think that to begin with, I guess I would urge everyone on this webinar to remember this their whole life. I mean, you're all young. The country did not have did not save from the oil boom, right? So we didn't save in the sunny days, and now it's raining. Well, it's not just raining; it's snowing, and it's a blizzard. And please remember that your whole life. I mean, you need to run your company, run your government, run your state, run your personal life in a way that you're resilient to these sorts of shocks, because they happen, right? I mean, so from my viewpoint, having been in Nigeria almost 12 years, I've been through the great financial crisis in Nigeria, through the recession 2016, and now the gravest financial crisis. So 3 humanitarian and financial crises in the space of 12 years. So it's not unusual event. So that doesn't help us now, but all of you remember that your whole career. So 30 years from now, when someone says, let's take a strategy that relies on things being good, you can say, that's not the way the world works. So for Nigeria at the moment, I think the only path forward is for the federal government to create some kind of bailout program for the states, where it supports them. It makes sure teachers get paid. It makes sure that they keep social stability, that some of the critical capital projects continue in the states, but they extract something from it, particularly around kind of cost of governance, transparency of state finances. And I think it may be forced on the country because, as I said before, I mean, we've applied for the emergency IMF funding, but that's not going to get us very far. We may have to go for a more full, because of the size of the demands. We may end up having to ask the IMF for help, and the IMF would extract conditions. And if part of the program was for the federal government to essentially help the states get through this, they're going to extract some conditions for that. But I have a very hard time seeing 30 of the states, well, and the other, even Lagos, it has a lot of IGR in theory, but economic activities come to a halt. So their PAYE revenue, VAT revenue, it's all going to decrease. So I think that there's going to have to be some kind of restructuring, and it's probably going to involve external money. But I don't see any other option for that, because as the question says, I mean, effectively in a matter of weeks, so many of the states are insolvent.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to take this question from a YouTube listener. Everyone is speaking of an upcoming recession. What shape of recovery do you think we should expect? A V, a W, a U, or L?
I think it's a U with a pretty flat bottom. So as I said, I mean, I expect and I've seen people talk about recovery coming out of lockdown. I personally, and I said maybe I'm too pessimistic, but every stage of this health and economic crisis, people have underestimated the impact. And I mean, from the health side, people are saying Africa is just starting, right? I mean, we're going to enter May, June are going to be. We think it's difficult now with what's happened over the last 4 weeks of lockdown, but 3 weeks now, I guess, coming up to 3 weeks. But it's extended, and we think we're kind of deep into this. We're not deep into this. We're at the beginning. So my own expectation is that we have a U with a very flat bottom, and we haven't put I haven't put a projection because I don't have any economic modeling that knows how to do these projections. I don't know how others are doing it. They're just inventing it as we go. Excuse me, underestimating. But we have put out a number that we expect that not expect that we guess. We call it a guess that the economic growth in Nigeria is -5 to -10%. So you compare the pain we went through when it was 1.6%, and now -10. But to be perfectly honest, if we only had a contraction of 10% in 2020, I would count us as lucky because it could be worse.
Another question from one of the YouTube listeners. You mentioned the short-term action needed by the government. What are the long-term policies that can be effective to aid a speedy recovery?
Well, I think that, as I said, the short term very focused on making sure that the bottom of the pyramid has resources and has food. I think in the medium term, some of these structural things that people have talked about a long time are going to be forced on the government. So we've already seen two major changes that we've talked about for years. The government didn't take the steps forward. Now they've already done it. So the first, of course, is the fuel subsidy. NMPC, MD, CEO, very clear. No more fuel subsidy, no more fuel subsidy. It's over. And the government was effectively forced into it. On the exchange rate, what we've seen is the government devalued. So they went from 307, 305 to 360, and then the parallel rate's now gone to, well, let's call it the black market and the other, but the official parallel rate in effect's gone to like 380 to 390. So I'm trying to narrow that on that, and I think there'll just be more and more pressure for a unified exchange rate. But that makes you think of all sorts of other policies that are critical. So some of them I think that are very important. So Governor El Rufai, God bless him. I hope it's true that he's recovered from COVID-19, but he was leading the major committee on kind of the power emergency situation. And I know a little bit about the work of his committee. I think that the sorts of things that they recommend will now get implemented because we have no choice, particularly around kind of some sort of power decentralization. Other policies, there's definitely going to have to be a rethink of the cost of governance. So, I mean, we're all aware of the high cost of governance in Nigeria, not just your headlines about senator salaries, et cetera, but also just the sheer number of MDAs. Like the thing that's really making it difficult for the private sector to invest is not necessarily is the fact that the complexity of it, dealing with so many multiple MDAs. So I suspect out of this crisis, if we want to take any good out of it, it's some sort of restructuring that makes the business environment simpler. I think part of it will be, and many commentators have been talking about it, but we've talked about it a long time. Part of it's going to be that there'll be more emphasis on decentralization. So if we go to very interesting case studies, so India had major currency, financial, fiscal crisis in 1992, I believe it is. And they actually had to airlift their gold out to take an IMF loan and work through it. The outcome of that crisis was actually quite a marked decentralization, so that the states in India had more power to make their own decisions, to decide what their economic strategy was. And the net result is India over the last 30 years, since that time, 28 years, has done very well. So I suspect in Nigeria, we're going to end up seeing more economic decentralization. I don't want to call it restructuring because that's such a loaded political word on that. So, but a little bit like the India case, this is worse than what happened in India from the economic viewpoint because it's global. That worse than the India case, and I think the changes that we need to make to come out of it are going to be forced on the country.
Okay, thank you. One of the listeners is asking about quantitativism. He's asking how far can CBN go with supporting the federal government in this current situation that the economy is in?
Well, that's a very good question. The short answer is I don't know. So if you think about what earlier I described, the kind of fiscal interventions in countries like the UK and the US and Germany. So in these countries, the European Union, in Eurozone. So in these countries, they don't seem to have reached the limit to what they can do before they destroy their currency, in effect. I mean, they're in a somewhat of a deflationary environment. Effectively, these programs create money out of thin air. This has always been a heresy in classical economics. People now have started in the last 5-7 years to think that maybe in certain circumstances it would work. Helicopter money is a term people might have used, coined by Milton Friedman maybe 50 years ago now, and he did it as a very derisory or derogatory term. You can't create money out of nothing, expect it to work. People are now thinking at least those sorts of countries with strong currencies can create money, put it in the hands of the people spend it. And if we do 20-25% deficit spending or creation of money, it's not going to destroy the currency. So that's an interesting experiment. In our context of Nigeria, I don't think anyone would agree that we could create money supply 25% of the GDP and not have potential for a hyperinflation event like Venezuela and Zimbabwe. But could we create a lesser amount and do that? I don't think anyone knows the answer. My personal view is I don't think we have much choice. I think the CBN is going to have to go further in kind of the helicopter money direction, create this money to put in the hands of the bottom of the pyramid, and just hope that because the collapse in economic activity was so small, it's not creating any inflationary or hyperinflationary pressure. But they're going to have to go further. But I don't, we know the nature of the Naira. I mean, part of the problem is that so much of the inputs to the finished goods that we consume, well, some finished goods come in, they're already finished. And then a lot of things like even in the food supply chain, some of the ingredients are imported. So there's a limit to how many Naira the central bank can print, just because we then get, we get the depreciation of the Naira, which then it just means the problem is not solved, because of course it just means the price of imported goods goes up. So it's a long way of saying I think the answer is we can't do as much as some other countries, developed countries, but we can try to go further. And I think the CBN will be forced to go further in kind of monetization of the debt and just basically printing Naira. And of course, the program just to send Naira to people, that's what it is. We create Naira and send it to people.
Right. So the next question is, what are your perspectives on direction of the interest rate? Short term, medium term, long term?
Well, I mean, we all know that between the central bank and the federal government, we created a distortion between the OMO rates and the federal government of Nigeria rates. And as a result of that, the federal government of Nigeria rates crashed because people, particularly pension holders like the PFAs, which is about 7 or 8 trillion now, didn't have anywhere to put their money. So whereas before you could get rates, people are 13, 14%, used 18, 19, 2 years ago, I think. Now, if you go and try to buy treasury bills, 3, 4, 5%. So there's been that crashing out. On the other hand, the federal government needs money. So I think that I don't know whether the central bank would be forced into some kind of unitary interest rate policy where the OMO paper and the government paper kind of merged, in which case, if it was a blended rate, it would go up 8 or 10%. But I think that since the federal government needs to borrow more money, it's going to be hard for them to borrow at a 3, 4%, because even now, people don't want to part with their money when inflation's 12% and they're getting 4%. So I think we should expect over at least the short and the medium term interest rates, or certainly the federal government paper interest rates from that low level, are going to go up.
Right. So the next question, looking back at 2016, supposedly the federal government came up with the economic recovery and growth plan, I think, which somehow coincided with recovery in oil prices. Nigeria came out of recession, things became better. It appears we're in a worse situation now. Is there a plan for re-engineering the recovery process? Will that likely coincide with the recovery in oil price? And, essentially, we're trying to have some sense of when to expect things to get normal, looking at what happened in 2016. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think my personal expectation is, if we say normal, 2 or 3 years. Just this, it's not an official PwC position. I don't have any science. I'm just given the nature of this shock, though. I mean, why did the economic recovery and growth plan not work? So our view, which I've said publicly, I don't speak about a lot because don't try to tell too much bad news. But when I have spoken about the economic recovery and growth plan, I said, look, I think the basic idea, if you read the document, and of course I had to read the whole thing, it's like 200 pages, right? If you read the document, then any individual program, in a sense, sounds sensible. Like we want to do this, we want to do that, we want to do that. The problem with the economic recovery and growth program, however, is that in its totality, it's again far too complex. Too many programs, too much complexity, too many government agencies, new agencies being set up. It said, we got our 800 or 900 or 1,000 MBAs, and it's the government, because of all this complexity, rather than focusing on one or two things, didn't get very much done in terms of diversification, and didn't get very much done in terms of real recovery, right? So now we're in a situation where you're asking the government to do economic planning when we have a lockdown. They can't meet physically. The government doesn't have very good tools to do e-meetings and like the tools the private sector has. We've already experienced that. And even when they make a decision, because they don't have all the ability to physically go out and implement it, how does it happen? So I think it's very difficult to expect in the next 3 to 5 months kind of a coherent economic policy to come out that we can implement. I mean, obviously, and we've said this semi-publicly, I guess, it is critical that, focusing on the future, that we do get more investment in the country, make it not just from outsiders, but also from Nigerians, from the diaspora. All of those groups need to want to invest more in Nigeria. So we need to have policies, and again, just repeating myself, simplification to want them to invest. But I don't believe we're going to have, but first off, I don't think that what I've just said about the economic recovery and growth plan has necessarily been absorbed by the government. I've never heard them say, well, we recognize it was too complex. I don't think right now they're going to have the capability to kind of think through these issues. As I said, I think they need to focus on the very, very short-term things, and maybe in 2-3 months we can start thinking about how we start to come out in 6 months. But again, if we don't have some restructuring along the lines of simplification of devolving economic strategy decisions and economic power down to the state level, subnational level, we're just going to end up, if we just produce more programs, we're going to end up exactly in the same position as we were in the economic recovery and growth plan. And to some extent, I mean, I don't publicly criticize the CPN, and I think they do many, many things very well, but they have also been guilty to some extent of creating programs, all these intervention programs, and it's not really clear that they have the intended impact. And of course, the governor has come out now and said they're going to create more intervention programs out of this. So I'm quite concerned we're not going to necessarily have a coherent economic policy. But as I said, I think a lot of the decisions are going to be forced on them. Like if I go back to the India example, it wasn't that the federal government said to the states, we have a coherent strategy for you to take things forward. The federal government simply said, we don't have the capacity anymore to do all the things we did together. You're on your own to a large extent. And the states just picked that up and said, okay, we've got to figure out our own economic destiny. And I suspect, it's not a prediction, but I could see that scenario unfolding in Nigeria, where the federal government says, we can't help you anymore, but you've got to figure it out on your own. So.
Right. Okay. let's assume you're a private equity investor. What sectors will you be focusing on this period within the next 3 years?
Well, I mean, I think if we let's, I mean, I've given so much bad news. I mean, I still live here, and it's it's the biggest economic story on the planet. Has the potential to be, so all of those opportunities still exist. I mean, I've always liked. I mean, I've been big on agriculture, and I've seen so many people trying to do things on agriculture, agricultural processing, palm. Just a few weeks ago, running into palm oil producers in Delta, people that want to make tomatoes, hydroponics. So I think agriculture, the processing side of it, linking up to farmers, is still very positive. I think that. The infrastructure. I mean, I think there are people trying to build infrastructure in a way that is financeable and people get their money back. I mean, particularly groups like InfraCredit, run by Chinua, as an example of being able to structure the proper infrastructure things. I'm very big on real estate. I mean, I know people think it's risky, but we have this housing deficit. There's a lot of emphasis on it, just a little bit like Governor El Rufai is focusing on the power. His Excellency Minister Fashola is very focused on unlocking the real estate industry. So all of those things are I think very productive sectors for people that have kind of a risk appetite and have a longer term perspective. What I don't think is going to work very well. It could work for some people, but it's kind of the people who want to do short term trading. I mean, Nigeria, if you really want to build a big business, you've got the runway to do it over the next decade. As we come out of this, they said 6 months from now we might be returning to some semblance of being able to think a little bit further in the future. And I think companies that have the capital resources and the courage to help structure the whole industry have lots of opportunities in those areas. So power, real estate, agriculture, for example, and who are prepared to do things on a big scale. I mean, if you look at, obviously the poster child for investing in Nigeria is MTN. People thought that they had made an enormous mistake when they paid for the license. They paid too much, and why come at all? And yet they've built multi-billion-dollar business that very well. And so people who can do on a national scale, so people who can duplicate that on other key areas are going to do fine.
Hello, doctor.
Yeah, I'm here. Hello.
What are your thoughts on Naira devaluation?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things this is teaching us is, we don't really have control over the Naira. I mean, just the Naira is going to go where it's going to go. That said, I mean, oil price collapse, it doesn't have as big an effect as people might think. I mean, if you really thought 90% of our FX came from oil, then if the oil price goes to zero, then the country, FX goes to zero. What is one of the things that we've said publicly? I mean, well, first off, we were the ones that said publicly that it's very critical. I mean, the diaspora is really where the FX comes from, the biggest source of FX. So, the Naira is devaluing, has devalued. We need to make sure we're taking care of the diaspora to the extent. I mean, they're under financial pressure too, right? And yet, we need that money. We need the diaspora to be sending, supplying the FX to keep the economy going. So it's very critical that the federal government, well, the whole country and individuals who are supported by members of the diaspora, because it's a very individual thing, keep in touch with those people. And, they're under financial pressure in the diaspora communities, but they still need to support Nigeria. I think what will help the Naira value, though, is if, 3 to 6 months, as we said, if we're coming out with policies that look forward to some stronger economic growth, then there's people, there's not a lot of homes for capital, and people are going to be looking for homes for capital. So if we make it an attractive place to invest, the Naira value will move up. But if we don't use this opportunity, if we have both the oil price collapse, the diaspora under pressure, and it's not a good environment for people to invest their money, whether it's Nigerians, diaspora, or outsiders. Then the naira is going to continue to be under real pressure. So in a way, the naira value, we tend to think of just the oil impact, but where the naira value comes out, a lot of it depends on the policies that we put in place and just making it, if you want a strong naira, what does it mean to have a strong naira? It means people want to have the naira, want to hold the naira. That's what makes it strong. So then the logical question is, what makes people want to hold the naira? And if you make it impossible to exchange and difficult to invest, then people aren't going to want to hold, difficult to do business, people aren't going to want to hold naira. So there's kind of a mathematical certainty about that. So, but I'm hopeful that between the diaspora and a better business environment, that the future of the naira is not too dire.
Okay. The next question: what impact will FPI outflows have on the economic recovery? And is there anything the CBN can do to keep this money in, aside not providing dollar liquidity in the IE window?
Well, I mean, remember what the CBN's been doing, right? I mean, the reason this OMO program works is because they've effectively guaranteed to for foreign portfolio investors they can get out at the same price they got into. So that's how they kept it in here. I mean, to be honest, I almost think that the strategy should be just let the foreign portfolio investors go for now. It'll drain some of the existing dollar reserves, but at least we won't have the headache of trying to keep these people in the country. I mean, what kept these portfolio investors invested was getting these high OMO rates, while simultaneously they were guaranteed not to suffer from a exchange rate shock. But I think we've gone past that point, to be honest. And so I don't think we should be right now. I don't think that we should be using our precious resources to kind of try to keep the portfolio investors. I mean, because remember too, the price of keeping them in just keeps going up. They've got other problems, right? Like the safety, their own capital base. So I just think that we should focus on, if you take out the portfolio investors that could pull out, we still have over $20 billion of reserves. And I think we should just forget about trying to keep increasing the what we pay the portfolio investors to keep them in, and just move on to, how do we manage our economy to make it attractive more for direct investors? And then over time, we'll get the portfolio investors back. But we've just paid a heavy price to keep portfolio investors in the country, and we're going to pay a heavier price if we try to keep doing it in the present circumstances. But that's just my own perspective.
Right. Then someone is asking, looking at the FMCG industry and professional services space, what's your view on how this affects them locally, and how can they maintain their going concern?
Well, I think FMCG, to the extent that they make basic foodstuffs, I mean, they're going to be under pressure, but there'll still be a demand, right? So if you actually look at what's happened, you've had many industries collapse, say in the UK, but people that produce food or sell food, we don't say they thrive, but they're still in business, right? So I think, and so if I took just as an example, a company like Tolaram, I mean, they're very smart. Everyone eats Indomie noodles. I eat Indomie noodles. I think that they'll be able to adjust to it. The Unilevers, the local UAC, the local ones. Professional services is a bit interesting. I mean, obviously, so if you take the big four, for example, I mean, it has an impact on our practice, obviously, but quite a lot of the work that we do is in effect mandated by regulation, right? So, listed company or PLC has to have an audit. So you have to hire an auditor. So at least there's a certain volume of work that we're going to get. So we're not going to collapse to zero. The other thing that happens, certainly in professional services, which I think is very sad for the people on this call in the short term, is that that we stop hiring. So if you know the way a professional services firm works, and I'm sure that people have interned in it, but people only stay a few years. I mean, obviously some people stay longer in their career, but most people are turning over quite fast. So when we have a shock in a professional services firm, the way the professional service firm balances very rapidly is to stop hiring for a period, and then it rebalances. But hopefully we will, by the fall we'll be back hiring because it's important for us. We are, I think I think PwC is the biggest graduate hire in Nigeria.
Right. Someone is asking, in recent times, the CBN has come out to announce 50 billion intervention, 100 billion intervention for the pharmaceutical industry and allied companies. How much do you think these initiatives will have any significant impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies program by program. I mean, I think that what we found globally around the world is the issue is an intervention program, does it get the resources to the target group fast and efficiently, right? So, and in programs, before we come to Nigeria, some programs are being criticized. I mean, UK, for example, their small business intervention fund is being criticized because it's routed through the banks. It's only 80% support, so the banks are still doing their work on credit checks. So it's a very slow process. None of it's getting to the small enterprises, et cetera, right? So whereas I think the counterexample is Germany, where their program worked very effectively and they have a system to get it. So if we come to the Nigerian context, I mean, as I said, I think the central bank does many things right, but when you set up these programs from scratch, we don't already have a way to get money into the hands of certain people. So if you take, for example, the reduction in interest rates from 9 to 5% for their existing intervention programs, yes, there are some people that will benefit from that, but the program isn't that big. It's not that big a subsidy, so it doesn't kind of have widespread impact. So the two programs you described, again, may be helpful in the medium term, but in the short term, they're not set up into into an existing infrastructure. So to give an example, if we wanted to get money in the hands of the pyramid, so you've seen this whole debate about bank accounts and 5,000 naira limits, and if you have more than 5,000, you don't get it. The problem is we didn't have a system set up for a way to get money to the bottom of the pyramid. We didn't have a system to get money to SMEs. And now we're in the middle of a crisis where it's hard to get things done, and we're trying to set up a new system to do that. So I appreciate the efforts, and obviously the healthcare sector is critical, but you need these kinds of the systems in place before the crisis happens, because once the crisis happens, you can't set up a system rapidly enough that's going to deliver the resources where they're needed, when they're needed.
Right. Learning from your experience in the Nigerian economy, having been part of the previous recession and the economic crisis we've had in the last 12, 13 years, what would you like to see Nigeria do different? What will, buying from your experience in Nigeria and across the world, what will be a game changer for things to turn around and for Nigeria not to find the country in this kind of mess in the future?
Yeah, I guess I've written a little bit about this, and I use the term self-organizing. I mean, to be honest, I've lived all over the world, been so many places. I look at Nigeria and I say, to me, Nigeria should be the easiest place to prosper because the people are doing everything themselves. So if you think about the way the country is structured, I mean, the federal government and the state governments, they're actually very, very small compared to other countries in their spending. And the total spending, I think for 2018, the total spending by all three levels of government was 14 trillion naira. Now, that sounds like a lot, but the economy's 140 trillion naira that year. So it's only 10%, and 2 trillion of it was interest spending. So the amount spent on, let's call it goods and services, governance, was 12 trillion naira. Again, it sounds like a lot, but there's 200 million Nigerians. So per Nigerian, it's 60,000. So 60,000 naira, you're supposed to pay for education, healthcare, primary healthcare, security, governance, power, infrastructure. How do you pay for it with 60,000 naira for every Nigerian? You don't. So the government doesn't supply power, it doesn't supply infrastructure, it doesn't supply security, it doesn't supply education, it doesn't supply healthcare. Where do these things come from? People organize themselves to supply it the best they can. It's not ideal, but I'm sure everyone on this call in their family situation knows how you deal with these issues. So in effect, because the government state sector has been so absent in people's lives, people said, well, we can't rely on it. We'll get on and we'll do other things. So the reason I'm saying that, if you ask, what would I like to see? I would like to see Nigeria harness that to get to where it has to go. I mean, as I said, I think this is the easiest country in the world to manage because people just get on with doing things if you let them get on with them. And again, it's, I think, connected to decentralization, being able to organize things at lower, not just even state level, but LGA level. But I run into so many Nigerians that are doing amazing things. And those who follow me on Twitter know I try to highlight it where I can, but doing amazing things in education, in healthcare, NGOs, community service. No one asked them to do these things. They just organized them themselves. So, what I would say to government, have said publicly, is, again, this whole point of simplification. Let Nigerians, they're so talented and so energetic, let them just get on and solve the problems themselves. When you put barriers up for them to solve the problems, that's when we create all the issues that we have. And I know so many people trying to do things. I mean, young people trying to build businesses, for example, and the energy level they have is so great, and they're just, they're totally fearless. But as you get into the kind of barriers you run into to trying to do business or run an NGO in Nigeria that we're all familiar with, it just takes your energy out, and eventually some succeed. God bless them, but some they lose the energy or eventually run out of money, etc. So that's what I would like to see. I would just like to see let Nigerians get on and build their own country, because they would do just fine.
Okay. Then we'll round up very soon. I would like to ask this question. What are the options for the subnationals?
Well, I think it's one of the things that's interesting is, so we've been talking about subnational issues for 3-4 years. And what's happened is that other people have really picked up on it. And not necessarily because we said it, but we're all saying the same thing. So we're seeing it in the country. So if you now listen to like PEBEC, so Dr. Jamoke, who is brilliant. I mean, I'm sure you just follow Dr. Jamoke, who runs PEBEC, or Yolanda Sanuko, who runs NIPC. Both of those people, federal government officials running big pieces of things, have now the last year, 18 months, much more focused on subnational. How do we help states do their ease of doing business? How do we help states attract investment? So that's a very positive sign. Governors themselves, I don't say it publicly, but I'm sure people on this call from all over the webinar from all over the country, I'm sure you can point to your governor and sometimes not be, you don't think the states moving in the right direction. But the truth is, I think there are a lot of governors that are trying very hard and doing some things. So governors that we're very supportive, that I personally am more aware of, but talked about Governor El Rufai Kaduna. Big fan, obviously, but big fan of Governor Sanwo-Olu in Lagos. Big fan of Governor Obaseki, though I know it's challenging out there. Big fan of Governor Makinde, and I've heard of other governors doing things. So I think that states choosing a good governor is hugely important. So even in the country, I think people recognize how critical the subnational development is. And then, of course, globally, this has been recognized. So if you went and talked to the IFC, if you went and talked to the World Bank, they now are talking subnational. 3 years ago, they didn't. They were kind of always in Abuja. But now they realize if you want to move Nigeria forward, you don't need to necessarily be in Abuja. You can be in Mina, you can be in Edo, you can be in Cross River, you can be in Abeokuta. And that's where really, for a country of 200 million people, the other thing that's critical for the country is we can't continue to have Lagos be such a dominant share of the national economic activity. I don't know whether it's 30 or 40%, and depends how we measure it, but it's just, it's a problem for Lagos because if you talk to the political people in Lagos, every time there's something successful happening in Lagos, it just attracts more people for economic opportunity. It's fantastic, but it doesn't work. It's too much pressure on the infrastructure. And for those of us who live in Lagos, I mean, it's if you could live somewhere else and do the things you like to do and be economically productive and support your families, much rather be in Baden or Calabar or Avia. I mean, it's just a nicer environment. Yet so many people are forced to deal with the Lagos traffic, the Lagos stress. I mean, one thing that just shocked me was I had assumed the average life expectancy in Nigeria is 53, which is a very sobering number. And I had assumed that it would be higher in Lagos because Lagos is a lot wealthier than other parts of the country. But in fact, the official number for the average life expectancy in Lagos is also 53. So what you gain in kind of economic, just richer state, much richer state, you lose in all the stress, traffic, pollution on that. So we need development across Nigeria at every state.
Okay. There's this question about the Finance Act that was passed, I'm sure, without expecting COVID to hit. So what are your thoughts around government tax revenues? The companies are shut down. And then there's another perspective of the donations that the private sector are making to the COVID intervention schemes.
Yeah.
Will that count? What are your thoughts?
Well, on the Finance Act, I mean, we're big fans of the minister, Her Excellency Minister Ahmed. I think if you saw her speak, she said something that was very, very critical, which is, look, we haven't had a new Finance Act in 20 years. What we're doing this year is not perfect, but we're trying to fix some things that were problems. Just be aware, though, that we're going to continue to do it every year. So I think we were so supportive of it because she recognized it wasn't like you just did this fantastic Finance Act and went away. You made some changes the best you could. You listened to to different stakeholders and all the balancing competing interests, and the next year you make improvements. So that was very important. She did some very smart things like exempting SMEs with under 25 million in turnover for paying VAT. Critical because you want to bring them in the formal system, but they don't want to pay more. If they get bigger, they can start to pay a bit of tax. But when they're small, they can be recorded, so they're in the formal system, but not necessarily pay tax. So we were very supportive of it. There were some other technical things that she took care of that had been problems, like double taxation. But of course, her plan for the next version. So the work on this version went on in September, October, came into force. I think it's in January, if I remember right. But there was supposed to be new work for the next version. And of course, it's all got derailed. And then we've had very rapid kind of fiscal interventions that you mentioned. I mean, in terms of the private sector, what can we say? I mean, I can tell you that certainly like our organization, the big banks, the big companies, we're all talking to each other, trying to come up with, how we intervene. So we're part of, so the CBN and GT Bank and some Access Bank, got together early to create a program around the healthcare itself and some palliatives. We're part of that. We have our own program where we both, the staff and partners, give money and then also technical support. We're trying to sort out, but everyone in our position is trying to figure out how do you get the money that you have or the resources to the right people in a timely way? And it's just not easy because we don't have those systems set up. So we're struggling with that. We're going to do the best we can with the donations we make to try to get to the people who need it most. And everyone in the private sector is in the same position. And the one thing I can say, though, is that the organized private sector, the big companies, the senior people, I mean, they all understand that this is the biggest thing we're ever going to face, that we're in it together. We need to support each other. We need to give what we can, support in a small way. I mean, I know lots of church groups, NGOs are doing things in every community, and then support in a big way the best we can. And we'll all be remembered by what we did during COVID-19.
Right. Um, Looking at the current government and the issues that we have to face now, do you foresee a movement towards convergence of monetary, structural, and fiscal policies?
Well, I think in terms of a monetary convergence, so a single unified exchange rate. I mean, I think the direction of travel is that the governor started it. The events have, as I said earlier on the webinar, events have pushed to narrow the gap between the official rate and the parallel rate. So I think that's the direction of travel. I think in terms of coordination, I mean, I think one mistake people make in Nigeria is that they expect too much from the governor, too much from the CBN, too much from monetary policy. There's a limit to what monetary policy can do. And maybe the best analogy I can give is monetary policy is like the race car driver, okay? So if you give a race car driver a car from the 1920s, he could be the best race car driver, but he's going to drive the car as fast as a car from the 20s can go. If you give him or her a car from the 1950s, it would go at the speed of the 1950s. If you give them a car from 2020, it'll go at the speed of a 2020 car. So we always talk about what moving monetary policy rate up 50 basis points, down 50 basis points. And I've always said that to me is a really small issue. The fundamental issue is not even fiscal policy; it's structural questions about the economy. Can we unleash the energy through structural changes? And I think the central bank is by far, well, in Africa certainly. I think even globally, technically, I mean, it's technically the strongest institution public institution in Nigeria. They've done so many things right. They're going to do their part. It's more, as I said, not even really fiscal policy, but restructuring of the government's role and the intersection between private sector and government that's critical here. And the CBN will always support it. As I said, they're very, very talented.
Right. I have one more question from here. Looking at the oil prices, post-COVID, expecting that consumption will begin to rise again. What's your estimate of the height of the oil price?
Yeah. Okay. This is a very interesting question, and it may be premature to think about it, but you're something I think maybe everyone could go think about if you're interested. How is life going to be different after COVID? Right? How are things going to be different? So there was the hope, President Trump. So just by way of clarification, I love America. I love the United States, but I'm not American. I'm Canadian. So, if you go back to kind of what people were saying in February, there was this hope of this, and we used the term in this webinar, V-shaped recovery. So we have an economy doing quite well by many metrics, crashes out, so unforeseen, bounces right back to where it is. I don't think that's true, because I think that people are gonna this experience once in a lifetime crisis, like any crisis of this magnitude, people are going to think about it and change. And one obvious change is people aren't going to travel as much. So what's, you look at, I mean, we struggled a bit with the technology today. We sorted it out. This is happening all over the world, all over Nigeria. People are getting smarter and smarter on using technology to be able to accomplish things. So the last international trip I took was March 9th. I went to see a client in Ghana. So I went in the morning, flew to Accra, was the client 3 or 4 hours or something, had a few meetings, the main meeting, got back to Lagos that night. I don't think at post-COVID, people are going to do that sort of trip. So if that happens on a widespread scale, I said before the demand for oil was 100 million. Even when the economy comes back to normal, maybe the demand's only going to be 80 million. So where's oil price going to be? I don't think it's going to be 50 or 60. I'm not here to make predictions, but just personal view. I think it's going to be 30, 40 at the most. And then you combine it with the pressure around climate change, et cetera. So I don't think that you look at all the problems that we've run into on relying on oil. My view is it's certainly the post-COVID strategy cannot be relying on oil getting to $50. And similarly, there's going to be reduced demand for air travel, reduced demand for hotels, cruise ships. I don't know if they're ever going to come back. Some people think they will, but I think there's going to be a lot of impacts like this in people's personal behavior that then roll on to business. So that's one reason I said U-shaped. But the U on the other side may be a lower, maybe a non-symmetric U.
Okay, then I'm going to take this final question before I allow you to give your final comments. How long do you think the CBN will be able to defend the Naira before they finally leave it to float?
Well, I hope there's no press on here. I don't want to be quoted on. Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess I just sharing a candid view. I find it. I don't think. I think as we go through this crisis, they're going to have to float the Naira. I just think it's just going to become. We talked about the India example. We talked about the fuel subsidy being gone. I mean, crisis forces change, and I think they've already taken one major step. I mean, the governor took a number of steps to unify the exchange rate, but we still had, different exchange rates. We've taken another step, and I think events will force the Naira just to be, find its own level. I mean, and part of the reason for it, if you think about it, it's you go back, and we were the ones that said that the ask for remittances were a bigger source of FX, but we were saying that when oil was $50. Well, now oil is zero. There's no FX that comes from oil, right? For at least the next little few months. So then, how does the CBN? Their source of control was always the fact they had the dollars, right? You think about it. Well, now they're not going to have the dollars. The only people who have the dollars are the diaspora that are sending them to Nigerians. They're going to control it, and they're not sending it to the government. They're sending it to individuals, right? So I think that the CBN is just going to find, if they aren't the ones with the dollars, how are they going to control the exchange rates?
Right. Yes. So, Dr. Nevin, I want you to give your final words. I think the question I have on my mind, I want you to also add is, I'm sure somebody is thinking in his mind, okay, I have some money. Should I invest in the stock markets now that shares are down? Or I'm not so sure when things are going to recover. Let me keep my cash. What will be your perspective? And then I'd like you to give your closing remarks while we're up.
Well, I think, I mean, obviously, at any time of crisis, you have options in terms of your investment. I guess what I would say is, you need to structure your situation so you're not taking undue risk. I mean, if you think about what happened with this oil price crash, for those of you who followed it closely, I mean, the big headline was oil went to minus $40. How does it go to minus $40? Well, what happens is that that particular contract, so it's a futures contract, but it allows physical delivery. Okay, so that the oil producer has sold their oil, and then a settlement date comes, the physical producer can deliver the oil physically. That's how they settle their side of the contract. Okay, right. And the person on the side of the contract has to take the oil. Well, most of these contracts get settled financially. Like, what happens is that the traders close out their positions. So as you get to the day, it's just the people who want physical delivery that get physical delivery. Well, in times of extreme stress, that mechanism breaks down, and because the stress here is there is no storage for the physical delivery. So people who were long, who were going to be taking the oil had nowhere to put it, and then they need to get rid of it at any cost. So then you have trades at minus $40. Now, why do I raise this story? Because in these highly volatile markets, you can get wiped out in a day. I mean, anyone on this call that's familiar with the way some of these markets work, a little bit of leverage, I mean, you can go bankrupt. There are, it's not public, but I'm sure by the end of the month in April, we'll see when they file their results monthly, a number of hedge funds that were on the wrong sides of trades and just got wiped out. So my personal counsel would be, you can certainly look for assets that you may think are undervalued, but don't go so far in that you're going to put yourself or your family at financial risk by doing that. That said, you have to ask yourself the following question. Go back to what we were talking about. How much could we do in terms of monetization of the situation in Nigeria? When you look at the unprecedented monetary actions, fiscal and monetary actions of the US, of the UK, of the ECB, are fiat currencies going to be worth anything? Or are they all stretched it too far? So then the question is, do you actually want to be in hard assets? So you prefer to be in real estate, you prefer to be in gold. It's obviously moved up a lot. It may move up a lot more. So I think that's something to think about on the investment side. Now, let me make some final remarks. First, let me just thank you for bearing with me on the. One of the things I'm learning, I'm more of a computer guy than a phone guy, but I'm learning actually for these sessions how much better it is to use the phone than the computer. So on that, so thank you for that. Everyone in this call is a young Nigerian professional. You all have a responsibility to make Nigeria the place it should be. This is the gravest crisis. God forbid, I hope there's never anything worse than this, but the gravest crisis that I think any of us as collectively will face in our lifetime. So I think it's up to each of you to decide, what role can you play to help Nigeria and Africa get through this with this as best we can. The best we can in terms of loss of life, in terms of destruction of lives, in terms of destruction of businesses, in terms of unemployment, in terms of suffering. What can you do to help? And, if enough enough Nigerians do the right thing to help, then we'll get through it the best we can on that. And, Nigeria is a young country. I've always put my faith in young Nigerians. That's why I wanted to do this session with you if it's helpful at all. But all of you should be asking, what can I personally do in my community, in my church, in my mosque, in my NGO, in my business, my family, to help us work through this. So thank you, and God bless Nigeria.
Doctor, thank you so much for your time tonight. I'm going to hand the session over to Miriam to appreciate you and also to wrap the session. But I just want to say thank you for giving us the opportunity to share from your perspectives and to help us to be better informed and positioned on what to do to go through what's happening to all of us globally. And we look forward to seeing you when you get back to Nigeria after COVID. So Miriam, I'll hand over to you to wrap the session. Thank you.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you very much for this wonderful session. I actually learned a lot from it, and I'm sure every other person on this call did too. Thank you very much for granting us audience from the beginning of the communication to this very moment. On behalf of Finance Professional Network, I'm saying a very big thank you to you.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure. Thank you. Everyone on this call and your families, you stay safe, okay?
Thank you.
So all the participants on this call, we really appreciate you for staying with us so far. You've been wonderful, and thanks to Dr. Andrew Nevin for a wonderful session. Also, thanks to Abraham Drosawo for moderating this session. So also, as a point of notification for all the participants, we've been doing this session for the past 4 weeks. So we've had different facilitators come here on Zoom to speak to us about the COVID-19 environment and its impact on the macroeconomy. And Dr. Andrew Nevin have done a wonderful job at closing out this session. So for next week, we won't be having any session in this next week because we'll be taking a brief break and we'll be taking feedbacks from all our participants that have been with us for the past 4 weeks. How do you think we can improve upon this? And what are the programs you are looking ahead? Like, what are the sessions, the kind of section that you're looking out for? You can always reach out to us on all the social media platforms, Instagram, Twitter, and all our social media platform, LinkedIn. We are active on all social media platforms, and your feedbacks would be welcome. And also, we do send emails to all our registered participants, where you can get to listen to the playback session of this webinar we just had with Dr. Andrew Nevin. So kindly add our email so that our email do not go into your spam box or your junk box. So as much as you get those email, try to add them so that you get them directly in your inbox. So once again, we want to say thank you for staying this long with us, and thank you to Andrew Nelvin for also staying this long with us. For those that want to join the team, you want to join the Finance Professional Network, look out for our email. We will send an email by tomorrow where we would share our appreciation by mail. Just look out for our email. We'll send you the link on how to join this wonderful network of professionals. It is, we'll be bringing this session to a close right now. Thank you so much. Stay safe, and God bless you all.